My name is Jarrid Kleinfelter. I'm a solutions architect with AWS, based in Milwaukee. So I primarily support financial services customers, but then I also focus on cloud operations as a specialty. So I talk to customers about governance, control, management, those types of things. So just a quick question, who hasn't heard of AI, right? Everybody's heard of it. It's pretty underrepresented technology, right? So we're going to talk about it in the context of ways to use it in your operations. So probably everybody here has heard about it or used it in sort of a software engineering capacity, writing code, reviewing code, all of those kind of things. But what I'm seeing a lot with my customers is ways to use that for SRE and cloud operations type activities. And so a couple components that sort of go into this. The first one, on the left here, some kind of agentic sort of developer assistant tool. In my example, I'm saying Claude Code. You could for this particular use case, you could swap that out for your preferred tool, right? At AWS, we have Kiro, Kiro, Kiro. If you've heard of that or played with that, that's our first party developer IDE tool. That you could use that perfectly well here, or any of the other ones that you prefer. I find Claude Code being used a lot within my customers. It works well, it's well known, it's well documented, that type of thing. The nice thing is you can run Claude Code through Amazon Bedrock. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So it still kind of keeps it within the AWS ecosystem, but you're using the Claude Code as your tool. So that's kind of the first part of this. The second part is MCP. So if you're not familiar, Model Context Protocol, it was something that came out to essentially allow agentic tools or agents to interact with backend systems. So you might have APIs, you might have whatever kind of backend system that you want to integrate with, and MCP is kind of a natural language interface to that. I would say I'm seeing also now these tools are getting better at just calling APIs directly. So in some cases, you may not need an MCP. You could just curl those APIs directly. But for this particular case, I'm talking about the AWS MCP server and how to use that. So we're using an MCP as part of this sort of tool chain here. And then the third part of it is skills. So, you think about a skill, it's essentially a pre-written prompt that you give to your tools, your agent assistant. And so it can be conditions, it could be constraints, it could be constants that you want to always use as you're kind of using these tools. So as we go through some of these examples, we're going to be asking questions about our AWS environment, but there's some certain things that we want to always make sure they're true. So we want to be able to assume roles into other accounts. We want to do these types of things. So the skill sort of outlines those constants. So think about skills as they're kind of like a run book, but it's something that your AI agent then executes against. So those are kind of the components there. I mentioned Claude Code. So hopefully if you've used it, right, it's a very capable tool. It's getting improved all the time. But one thing you can do is you can run that through Amazon Bedrock for your model inference. So there's some trade-offs, right? So if you go, say, first party through Anthropic, you got subscription models, things like that. With a lot of customers, they just prefer to use their existing AWS environment and their ecosystem to run the tokens and the inference through that for their agent tools. So if you're running it through Bedrock, there's just some parameters that you need to set within Claude Code. You need to tell it which models you want to use, so the Bedrock inference endpoints that you want to use. You have to tell it how to authenticate so that you have access to those inference endpoints, so you can tie it to like your AWS CLI profile, those types of things. So some of the nice benefits about that is you can use IAM policies to govern access to those models from your tools. You can use CloudTrail, which you're probably familiar with from a logging and audit perspective. You can use VPC endpoints. You can use guardrails. And then the big one is you can use it for sort of regional data residency. So if you have requirements to only call within a particular region, you can point it to that endpoint. If you say, well, no, I'm okay having it anywhere in the US, you can use the cross-region inference endpoints in Bedrock to say keep it within the US regions, or if you don't mind, you can use the global endpoints. Some of the other benefits, so unified billing. So there's several ways that you can tag sort of consumption of the models through Bedrock. So you can create application inference endpoints. So that's kind of at a high level. Say, I want everything that goes to this endpoint to be tagged a certain way. You can do individual user tagging, so that'll propagate through to like your cost and usage reporting and some of your downstream FinOps tools. Or you can tag it at an individual model call. So every call can be tagged, so you know like exactly where that came from. So these centralized access, so you can use, if you're using Identity Center and SSO for your AWS login, you can tie that into your profile, which you then use with Claude Code. So it just integrates really well with your existing ecosystem. So how does this all play together for this particular use case? So got Claude Code installed, we've got it configured to use Bedrock. I want to now set up the AWS MCP server. And if you've not used it, essentially it has a couple different tools. So it has things like it can search AWS documentation, it has knowledge indexing. But what it really does well, if you've ever used the AWS CLI, very powerful, right? But then you got to learn every parameter, every input. If you're doing things like filtering and queries, there's certain syntax that you have to remember. You just end up going back to the documentation often. So the MCP, it understands that, right? So it knows how to call AWS CLI commands, things like that. So now you're just talking to it in natural language, and it's writing the commands to execute for you. It can do all the common things that you would expect with services, describing, listing. It can do updates or creations, right? So those are things that you could do through the MCP. I'll talk a little bit about how most customers are kind of constraining it to a read-only mode, because you probably are maybe not yet ready to let an agent wild and create AWS resources, but in theory, right, it could do that for you. And then pairing that with a skills file, a skills markdown file that you put into Claude or your agentic tool of choice, that sort of gives it instructions on how to assume roles. So by default, the MCP server is really good at knowing how to connect to one AWS account. So it does that through your profile that you have set up through your CLI. And you can set up multiple profiles, but it starts to get unwieldy if you're a larger enterprise that has, say, hundreds or maybe even thousands of AWS accounts, right? It becomes something you can't really manage that way. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how you can deploy this MCP and then use it to assume roles throughout the organization. But what the skills do is it sort of gives it instructions on how to do that, how to do STS assume, how to go and list all of my accounts in my organization first before you start to go and iterate through all of them to do some kind of lookup. So that's sort of where the skill fits in. And there's a little snippet there. It's much longer in terms of the instructions that it has there. So what does the architecture kind of look like here? So we talked about, you've got a client, you've got, in this example, Claude Code set up. You've got, you authenticate in some way. If you're using Identity Center and SSO, it's really easy. It's just a parameter in your Claude settings file. You tell it which profile to use. It's even good that if you don't have a current token, it'll recognize that and it'll pop you out and you can authenticate. It'll refresh your token and then it'll kind of continue on. So a really nice integration with SSO. In the middle here, so of course you can run the AWS MCP locally, just like MCPs, right? But again, it's going to be sort of restricted to or constrained to hooking up to your profile. So an alternate way you can run this is actually deploy that AWS MCP server out into, in this case, I'm using Agent Core runtime. So If you're not familiar with Agent Core, it's kind of an ecosystem of a number of different features. But one of them is you can take MCPs, you can bundle them as a container, and you deploy those to the Agent Core runtime. And so the nice thing about Agent Core runtime is from a cost perspective, you only pay while there's active CPU cycles being consumed. So if you think about why that's important, is when you make calls to an LLM, there's a lot of sort of like waiting and think time, right? The LLM's doing the work. My tool or agent is just kind of sitting there waiting for a response. So while you're running these tools in Agent Core runtime, you're only paying what's actively doing something. So just a nice kind of feature from a cost perspective. Agent Core runtimes, just like most things in AWS, can have an execution role. So like Lambdas and EC2s, right? You give it an execution role. So you can give your runtime a role. And this is where you kind of constrain it. So you say, even though me as a user, I may have the ability to do all sorts of things in my AWS account, but I don't want these agent calls to be able to do the same things that I do. So it's pretty common to say, give that runtime a role that only has read-only access to my AWS environment. And you can, there's a read-only access is a managed AWS policy out there, role. You could create a custom one if you wanted to even further restrict it, right? But that's kind of the nice thing, is you sort of bound that tool into what it can do in your environments. And then, on the right, in a large-scale deployment, you may have, like I said, hundreds, thousands of AWS accounts. What you set up then is you give that execution role, assume role into the accounts in your organization. And then likewise, in those accounts, you would need to deploy something that would trust back that centralized account and say, yes, I allow you to assume role into me as an account. So why that's important is, because now you're really interacting with the one tool, and it has the ability to go run queries and scans and answer questions across your whole AWS organization if you want it that broad. And again, think about this in the context of sort of a cloud platform engineer or a cloud operations or an SRE type role, where that's usually the scope of what those people have access to. This isn't so much, I'm not talking so much about individual, say, application teams. I'm talking about somebody who's got kind of that broad view across your whole organization. So that's kind of the architecture. I mean, if you're interested in this, talk to me, send me a message, what have you. I've put some wrappers around this. So I take the AWS MCP server that's out there. You can find it, it's on GitHub. But I put some wrappers around it that I build into my container to handle sort of the listing of all of the accounts. So if I send a question that says like, get me all the S3 buckets in all of my accounts, well, first of all, it has to go get a list of the accounts. So it'll run some CLI commands against the organization to say, give me a list of all the accounts first. And then it'll go through and sort of like iterate through them and do the assume role and then get the S3 buckets and kind of go through that. So I have all of that. If you're interested, I'm happy to share that. So a couple use cases, I guess, of what I've seen, how customers have used this and why I sort of talk about this. So one is version deprecation. So in this particular case, it was Lambda. You could be RDS. It could be anything that has a version that you need to sort of manage the versions over time. This, one of my customers, they had over 5,000 Lambdas that were on deprecated runtimes. And that was across hundreds of accounts, right? And so over the years, they've been creating reports. They've been trying to get application teams to upgrade their runtimes, these kind of things. But it really wasn't going anywhere. They were always chasing it. It just became a challenge to get anybody to care, or if they cared, just to carve out the time in their backlog to do the work, right? What they found was the reason was that there wasn't a consistent way that all of these Lambdas were deployed. Some were manually created in the console, some were through Terraform, some were through CloudFormation, just kind of all different ways that they were deployed. And so worked with the cloud operations team, and so we put all this together, and we were able to just very simply ask Claude Code in this example to go get this information, right? Just write out a prompt. I want to know all the Lambdas in my accounts, what's the runtime version they're on, what was the deprecation date for that runtime version. Go out and search my Git repos to see if you can find the infrastructure as code or the CloudFormation template that originally deployed that. Just all these kind of questions. And they were able to get a report built that they could then use to give the application teams a little bit more context and information to go fix this. Because now they're not just saying, hey, you've got Lambda running on an old version of Python, go fix it. They could say, hey, in this account, you've got these Lambdas running on this runtime version. It looks like you've deployed it from a CloudFormation template in this particular GitHub repo. Hey, we've got pipelines set up for that repo. Just go, of course you have to test, but fundamentally just go update the runtime in your CloudFormation template. It'll kick off the pipeline and it'll deploy it. And it took sort of the operational burden off of the application team because the cloud platform team gave them all that information up front. So you'll see some of the numbers in the right. This wasn't their environment. I ran this in my internal organization, which is small. I have 7 accounts or something like that. But I ran it, and you can kind of see some of the information that you could get. Just how many Lambdas, how many accounts, how were they deployed, those types of things. And the other thing that's good that Claude is really good at is generating. Move this over here. Is generating sort of HTML, right? It's really good at this. So you can start to create these types of reports. So they're not long-lived reports in a sense, but you're creating something and saying, okay, you got all this information. Now just generate me an HTML file or a report that I can use to present this. And so, you would see things like what account is it in, the Lambda. There's some links that link back to the GitHub repos, so you could include all of that. So just a lot of information that you can give to your teams. So a second example, probably common, I'm sure some people here, you've inherited something from somebody else. So a lot of customers, they might have had somebody come in and build their networking architecture, their VPC structure, all these kind of things. And it just sort of sat there for years, and it worked, and nobody ever really needed to worry about it. But since that time, maybe the partner who built it, they're gone, or maybe whoever internally had built it, right, they've moved on. And so now a new team inherits this environment, and they have to figure out how to support it. And so in the past, right, that meant that they were going in, they're looking at VPCs that were built, they're looking at route tables, they're trying to maybe go through VPC flow logs and trying to understand just how does the traffic flow through this AWS ecosystem. So this is another use case, right? So now I can just ask Claude with AWS MCP, say, go research this and start to draw me some architectural or traffic flow diagrams that depict how traffic really is flowing through my environment. If you've ever looked at VPC flow logs, right, they're relatively structured, but there's just so much data that you have to sift through. It's not that you can't do it as a human. It's just nice to have the tool be able to do it at scale. So using VPC flow logs, using route tables, using all this stuff, you can say, okay, generate me some visuals or some diagrams to represent this. Again, kind of from using HTML or whatever, right? You say, okay, create me an HTML file and kind of depict how this things look. So another use case. Third use case was another customer, and they wanted to make sure that all EC2 instances that were deployed were done in a consistent way. So did they have the right golden images deployed? Did they have SSM agents deployed? So again, these are things that you could do manually, but when you start to do it at a large scale, it just becomes kind of burdensome and kind of a lot of work. So again, they wrote a prompt, they used the AWS MCP, and they said, hey, go out and check, make sure that these instances have instance profiles, check if they have SSM agents deployed, check what AMI they're using. If it's not a standard one or an AWS managed AMI, try to figure out the lineage of that AMI. Did it originally get built from a managed machine image that then we've layered things on top of? Again, you could kind of start to use this for whatever you could think of, right? It's kind of the tools give you the access, and then it's just really the prompts that you're kind of asking it to go through. So I don't really have a live demo, one I'm not connected to. It's typically not very interesting. I mean, essentially you're in Claude Code, you open the terminal, you write a prompt, and it goes out and it churns through and it gives you back kind of the answer. The nice thing about deploying the tool centrally from a security perspective is you're also keeping all of those credentials for the role assumption inside the tool. You're not really exposing those short-term credentials into the LLM. So some customers, right, if they're sensitive and regulatory, what have you, you may not want to put some of that stuff in the LLM. So this way, it all stays within the tool, and the tool is doing the role assumption into other accounts. But you'll see that when you run this in Claude Code or whatever tool you want to use, you'll see that it'll kind of like do all that stuff, and then it just gives you the results. You don't see all those short-term AWS access tokens sort of flowing back and forth. So yeah, that's it. I don't know if there's any questions, any use cases you could think of where this might help, or like I said, if you're interested in the wrapper, let me know.